Hi, my name is Angela Lynn Tucker, and I am an assistant professor of practice in documentary expression. And welcome to a special SouthTalks, which is a town hall with Grace Lee talking about public media. So I'm going to just keep to these notes pretty judiciously because I want to make sure that we have enough time to talk about the things we need to talk about, and then your ideas are very much a part of this discussion, so I want to make sure that we have time to sort of hear your ideas. So if anything kind of comes up for you, just keep it in your brain because you're going to have lots of time to share. So public media has shaped many of our careers as filmmakers and storytellers. It's also an institution facing real questions right now about equity, access, funding, and its future. Tonight, we're talking openly about what public media has been, what it is right now, and what it might become. Our guest tonight is Grace Lee, whose bio I'm going to read. I've known Grace for a very long time, huh? A long time. So I'm really excited that she could join us here in Oxford. She's met with students. It's been really great. Grace Lee is an award-winning filmmaker whose work reframes how we see history, power, and community. Credits include the Peabody-winning Asian Americans documentary series, and She Could Be Next, about women of color transforming U.S. politics, both of which aired on PBS. She also directed the Peabody Award-winning American Revolutionary, The Evolution of Grace Lee Boggs, The Grace Lee Project, K-Town 92, and most recently, a feature doc about the fandom of global K-pop stars BTS, Forever We Are Young. So definitely check that out. I know that the Grace Lee Project is on Canopy, by the way, so, watch that there. So I first am going to talk with Grace and then read Castell's bio and talk more about Castell, our local luminary. So, this has been like Castell week. So I'm excited we catch her at the end of the Castell tour. Grace, first I wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of how you first entered the world of public media.
Is this on? Yeah? Can you hear me? Me and all the tech today. I'll just use this. Okay. Well, first, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be in Oxford at the Center for Southern Studies. I've really enjoyed meeting all the faculty and staff and students. The question was, how did I get into public media?
Yeah, when did you first enter public media?
I think many of us enter as children, like watching Sesame Street. I definitely, I'm the daughter of immigrants. I grew up watching Sesame Street. I probably learned how to read watching public media. But in terms of as a filmmaker, I think I really, I was always watching kind of documentaries because it's one of the few places I could have been, I'm older than most people and most of the students, where you could see independent documentaries. But I think it was with my film, American Revolutionary, The Evolution of Grace Lee Boggs, where I really felt like I entered the public media space as a filmmaker. And for me, it was important because that film was about this incredible character who I felt more people should know about. It's similar, more people know about Barbara Jordan, but public media felt like the place that we should learn about this person who had spent most of her life in many of the social movements of the past 70 years as a Chinese American woman in Detroit. And so, I always wanted that film to be on public media just because of who it would reach. And, I wanted everybody in America to have access to it. So public media really sort of started for me there. And then subsequently, I had many more works, either commissions or projects that I initiated that aired on the POV series or on national PBS. So.
Yeah. And so you were a lover of public media. You wanted to have your projects on there. You had your projects on there. When did you start to notice kind of the contradictions that you kind of noticed in the system? Grace wrote an incredible piece that for Beyond Inclusion, correct?
No, it was for the Ford Foundation.
Oh, for Ford Foundation, okay. So talk a little bit about the piece and what made you write it and how you started to notice these contradictions.
Yeah, so I think, it was an interesting process trying to get American Revolutionary on public media. I think that, public media has really given opportunities through initiatives like the Center for Asian American Media, Black Public Media, Latino Public Broadcasting. Those entities were created to, provide opportunities for a more diverse storytelling to exist on the public airwaves. And I think as I was sort of navigating that space, I was just looking at, just how difficult it was to sort of break through on my own, right? The essay that I wrote in 2020, I was actually asked by Chi-Wei Yang at the Ford Foundation Just Films section. They commissioned 40 writers, documentarians, artists to just write a provocation about anything you wanted. And this was right after Asian Americans, the history series, and She Could Be Next aired on national PBS. So I felt like I had something to say about, this topic. And the piece was really about, if America wants to truly reflect, or if PBS wants to truly reflect, this country, it needs to have more than one lens. And, I sort of used the opportunity in a 500-word essay to talk about Ken Burns and why does Ken Burns get so much space, and I pointed out in this essay, it took 10 years to get 150 years of Asian American history onto PBS, whereas, there's series like 13 episodes on the Roosevelts, right? Or 8 hours on the American buffalo, and sort of comparing like the buffalo versus like Asian Americans felt like there was something, I just needed to get that off my chest. And so that's what the essay was about. You can look it up. So yeah, and I think that's really where, I wanted to, they said, write a provocation. I'm like, okay, I'll do this and see where it comes out of it.
Yeah. What was like the reaction to the piece?
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so when I wrote it, I really just wanted to get 500 words off my chest. What I didn't anticipate was that journalists started asking Paula Kerger, who's the president of PBS, did you read this essay? What did you think about it, right? And then, she said, well, I respectfully disagree with Grace Lee. I've never met Paula Kerger in my life. And suddenly I'm being named in like newspaper articles. So what happened was a group of my peers, sort of mid-career documentary filmmakers, I was very busy. I had some like health issues at that time. I wasn't really going to do anything, but they're like, no, we can't just let that question lie. We need to respond. And so we wrote an open letter asking, okay, well, why do you disagree? Like, where's the data to back it up, And so we just asked some questions of the system. And then, that was maybe 10 of us. And then that became an open letter that maybe eventually like 700 independent documentary filmmakers, most of whom who had work on PBS, signed. And so it became a kind of viral it was on NPR, there were newspaper articles about it, and so it sort of gained this kind of traction. And then subsequently, I had a couple colleagues who said, well, would you like to make this into a podcast? And I'd never made a podcast before. I was like, sure, why not? It'll be my pandemic project, since this is all during the pandemic. And yeah, so then that sort of created this opportunity to ask deeper questions about, where is the public in public media?
Mm-hmm. And before I play a little excerpt from your podcast, I wanted to take a step back and say, for people who may not know how public media works behind the scenes, sort of funding, gatekeeping, distribution, et cetera, how would you describe that ecosystem?
Confusing. I mean, there's still, even when we were working on the podcast, and even people who have worked in public media for many, many years still don't understand how it works. Like, what is the Corporation for Public Broadcasting? You know, what does it mean to be a station film? Like, all of these things, even, you know, I had attended like something called the PBS Producers Academy at WGBH in Boston. Did you do that too?
Yeah, I did it.
Yeah, and they were trying to explain like the Byzantine, you know, kind of structures, and I still don't get it. Even when we were making the podcast, I didn't get it. And I think that that is something that is, you know, a real deficiency for something that should be so open and accessible to everybody. Yeah.
So,
oh, can I set up what we're gonna?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So this little clip is from. So the podcast happened in 2021. It was quite a few years ago, and you know, my colleagues and I who created it, we thought, you know, over the years we had tried different things. We were like, we don't want to keep doing episodes on this. We're busy. We don't have any funding. But in the last year, where you know so much was happening with the defunding of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the rescission from Congress of funding for public broadcasting, we realized, and at the same time people were telling us about what was happening to them from the independent filmmaker perspective, we thought, well, let's just do some conversations and like hear what people are going through. And you know, I recommend people listen to the second season for a more updated version of the history of what we reported in 2021. And the clip you're going to hear is the final episode of the second season, where Ken Ikeda, Joaquin Alvarado, and I, who created this podcast, decide, okay, well, where are we now? Why did we do this, and where are we going? So I think that's also the launch for this conversation tonight.
The system got its ass kicked. So it's like, you don't want to get right back in the ring. You want to go like Rocky 2. You got to get your shit together here. So I feel like we need people in their 20s and maybe 30s to step in and say, we'll take it from here, guys.
Hi everyone, it's Grace Lee. This episode closes season 2 of Viewers Like Us. Thanks to all of you who've listened and shared your thoughts during this challenging moment for public media. Your stories inspired us to pick up the microphones again and document this difficult chapter in PBS history. Season 1 was a deep dive into PBS's past and decades of organizing by independent filmmakers for a more equitable system. This season, though, we've worked with far fewer resources, squeezing in recording and editing whenever possible. Still, we felt it was crucial to capture these experiences before they were erased. Our goal was to create space for candid reflection on the collapse and defunding of public media. For this episode, my co-creators Joaquin Alvarado, Ken Ikeda, and I discuss where we stand after this summer's upheaval. Since 2020, we've asked what it would take to restore the public to public media. Now, with CPB defunded and even more resources at risk, the question remains, what's next? We began this podcast with a provocation, so it only feels appropriate to end with one, or a few. Take a listen.
Is that good? Okay. Okay. And yes, definitely check out the podcast. Okay. So now I want to bring Estelle into this conversation because, you know, what we played kind of brings up this question of, you know, is the system broken, or is it functioning exactly as it's supposed to function, right? So I'm going to read your bio. Dr. Cassell Sweet is a community engaged scholar from Memphis, Tennessee. Her work centers the lived experiences and collective memory of Black Southern communities. As director of the Center for Community Engagement at the University of Mississippi, she builds collaborative projects that honor local histories and expand community voice. Through her creative practices, her work foregrounds the importance of community care, intergenerational knowledge, and the power of everyday people to preserve and tell their own stories. So, you know, I wanted to engage Estelle in this conversation for many reasons. One, obviously, being able to speak sort of about the community at large, right? But also as a filmmaker, thinking about public media and, what role did you think public media would play? Sort of, you just completed a film. What role did you think public media would play in that film?
Yes, I was wondering if that was going to work. And thinking about our film, so one, I'll start that I backed into filmmaking, that I still really don't call myself a filmmaker. I know. But in doing community engagement, how do I engage communities around these stories, around these histories? I realized film was a method and a tool that I can do that in ways that I couldn't do prior to incorporating film into my arsenal and toolkit, because it's a way for people to engage stories easier. They're willing to sit down and watch a film before they're willing to sit down and have a conversation, but don't realize that they're engaging in a conversation by watching the film. So that's always been my approach to using films and documentaries as an engagement tool. And so which you'll notice a lot of the times I'm creating discussion guides or having conversations after them, because hopefully it's just not you consuming this information and this knowledge, but you engaging with it in some kind of way, and it's leading to action or leading to some kind of change of thought process or something different than you just consuming and learning from this information. And so I think I've started thinking about public media on the back end of that as an afterthought, not intentionally, but just by the way that I've backed into film in the same way of now backing into public media. So what is that role? And I think that's largely because when we think of public media, to Grace's point, we think about kids of Sesame Street and that education, early education, or then on the opposite end, that all the other viewers are retired people who have nothing else to do and they're sitting at home watching.
Downton Abbey.
Yes.
Yeah, Downton Abbey.
Seasons and seasons of, things that are reminiscent about whatever. But you're not getting that middle ground of community. And so now realizing, so what is the role of public media to, one, bridge that gap between the young folks and also the older folks? And then how do we engage across our wide spectrum? And so now we're starting to think, what does that look like and why is it important to have things on there? So if someone does decide to go to watch their public media, that there's some content available that they actually want to engage with, that they actually want to see. And so I think it's shifting, but I think largely the shift is going to come from what information is put there. So who is providing content that PBS is broadcasting, but then also how do we think about what we're expecting out of it too, and where we're directing people, and who's just deciding in their free time to decide to go and watch PBS.
Yeah. And I have one last question for the two of you, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So if public media is supposed to belong to the public, then what could or does accountability look like within the public media system?
I think the accountability looks like decision making. So who's making the decisions on what is being shown, what is being displayed, what does content look like? And I think that would determine and reflect community if those decisions are being made by community. And I know the harder it is when you incorporate, multiple people in decision-making processes, it gets difficult. But I think that has been the challenge of who's been over control over our public media. It's reflected their interests, so how do we shift that? And then in that way, community hopefully will feel like they have some agency of even knowing that transparency and the confusion of if you even knew who was the decision makers, how do I advocate to them if I don't know who they are? Or how do I advocate if I don't know the system and understand it? So I think it comes down to the decision makers and transparency over processes.
Yeah. What do you think?
Is this working? Oh,
Yeah.
This is working now. Yeah, accountability. I think when we talk about public media, it doesn't necessarily, for me, I think that there hasn't been a conversation about what is public media and what is it for. I think it speaks to the point that, what do we actually need our public media to do? Then maybe we can define who is the community. And I think that that's really important in this moment when things are collapsing and we can actually talk about, like, do we need it for, there was so much conversation about rural stations closing down and like people not being able to get like weather news and things like that. But, how do you define that on broader levels? Like, are we not getting access to certain stories or histories or news or information? So public health, like it is for the public, but who is that public, right?
Right, yeah.
So maybe that will sort of spark this. I'm very curious who is the public
Well,
here.
so I figured I have some questions, but I think I want to open it up maybe. So with this question of, public media is supposed to belong to the public. So that's why we want to kind of open it up to this room. So I have some questions, but I thought it might be interesting to just ask folks, what is the definition of public media? Like what they understand. What do you guys understand the definition of public media to be? So our friend Melanie will come to you if anyone wants to sort of answer that question.
I think of public media as media funded by public dollars and to provide information and to educate the public. I think that was the original intent of public media. I mean, I'm thinking about Mississippi in particular. The network of stations all around Mississippi was so that you could drive everywhere in this state and you were getting information from public broadcasting. Or before there was cable, you had a signal. It was usually a UHF signal you could get anywhere in the state. And that level of access is what, public media exposed me to French New Wave films for the first time. They used to show them on Sunday afternoons on Mississippi public broadcasting. So opening up the world to the public.
I'm really curious, like, what the younger folks in the room understand public media to be. Like, do you watch it? Like, what is it?
I also, when I think public media, I think education. So, like I said, I was saying either things for little kids so they're gonna learn, or documentary type things. And I'm just 70 years old at heart, and so at times, and so I listen to NPR and things, but I don't know how many people. I guess to your question, how many people younger than me, especially, are engaged with public media. But maybe because it's considered education in most people's mind. But that's most of what I think, a place you go to learn something.
And to Ralph's question too about, like, when you're talking being exposed to French New Wave, in public media, what are some other things that you have been exposed to because of public media?
I would say the access to the BBC, or actually in Washington where I live most of the time, we get a program from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation called As It Happens. And you get this perspective from Canada. So while we are trying to take over Canada, you can hear the Canadians talk about what it is they're feeling. So this connection to the world, and since there's been this lack of funding, I used to listen to a show called The World.
Yeah.
And that is no longer broadcast in Mississippi. So, we've lost that. We no longer have All Things Considered in the afternoon. We only have morning edition. So, but we have 2 hours of the Gestalt Gardener on Fridays.
Well, just the World, but also World Channel, last summer, the 3 documentary strands on World Channel, which is out of GBH, were disappeared.
Yeah.
So there's no longer 3 fewer strands for independent documentaries, non-commercial, non-fiction films, that looked at, one was called Local USA, one was, looking at international stories,
like that has no longer exists.
Yeah, America Reframed.
America Reframed, yes.
And then I think Voces is gone too. So wait, you had the mic. Well, I was gonna just piggyback on that to say, one thing that we didn't discuss, but I think is important for people to understand is as filmmakers, you know, I could imagine a career path in terms of making projects because of public media, right?
Right.
So, just to give you a very brief trajectory, it's like you can, you know, there's this thing called the Independent Television Service, which is a funding arm, I would say, and any filmmaker can apply to ITVS, they call it, and not only get funding for your film, but also once you know that your film will be shown within the public television universe, right? So either it would go to, like the film I just made, The Inquisitor, I applied for ITVS funding, I received that funding, that film is in the system, then the national strands all come to you and say, you know, they decide if they want your film or not. Independent Lens came to me and said, you know, we want this film. Then they license the film, and then you know, okay, your film is going to be broadcast nationally. For some people, the national strands don't go to them, and then they go into what they call the system, and that just means like every single PBS station can elect as to whether or not they want to show it, right? And so I mentioned that trajectory because it allows you as a filmmaker to have an understanding of, I know I can make a film, it's gonna be funded, and it will be seen by people, right? So people have built their entire careers around that timeline. So in other countries, like in Canada, where they, you know, give real money for films, or even in Europe, they have way more robust versions of this, right? Like people have entire careers where they like make real salaries, and they know every year that the National Film Board of Canada is going to give them a check for whatever films they want to make, and that's sort of how the arts are sustainable. So I just wanted to give you that context, especially how it speaks to makers, and particularly filmmakers, because that was sort of how I shaped, you know, my kind of early career, my present career, because my most recent film was funded this way. And that's how this kind of new shift, a lot of people are figuring out, well, how am I gonna get money and how is this gonna work?
Yeah.
And I was gonna say, I think that's important to note too, because of the independent filmmakers are making local stories or independent stories that are not guided by this larger kind of influence, but it's really coming from the perspective of an independent thought thinker. Mm-hmm. And so if that's no longer a space where, again, information is going out to the public, mm-hmm. then who is guiding the information that is being consumed if it's not by these independent views, independent perspectives, mm-hmm. independent editorial? And so what does that mean behind the things that we do consume if we're missing that independent voice?
And just to, you know, ITVS is funded by Congress, right?
Right.
That is taxpayer money going toward independent films, but not so much anymore.
Not so much anymore. I mean, it still exists, but it's now like private foundations. So private foundations are now keeping things like Independent Lens alive, things like ITVS alive, but then remember that those private foundations used to fund filmmakers individually and are now having to fund these corporations and these companies to keep them alive so that people can see the work. So then that means less money for individual filmmakers. So that's kind of how it all is affecting kind of the big picture of how are filmmakers going to make work if they can't afford to make work. It's just like it's become a real pickle that a lot of people are in right now. But one question I was thinking too, to kind of throw out to folks is, I know you were really interested in knowing within this audience, like what people, who do they even watch, or do they consume public media? Is that something? So I'm curious if more folks could talk a little bit about what they watch, if they watch anything on public media, what role public media plays in their lives, if at all. And I'm going to call on some people because I just have to. Janelle, can you tell us, do you watch public media?
Yes.
Yeah, well, Melanie will bring you the mic. Curious to know.
Okay, well, I'm a grad student here, so obviously I'm watching the Real South series that's funded by PBS. But I remember growing up, my dad would always play like NPR in the car. We were definitely NPR babies. And I do think that a lot of that really shaped, like, I was in like kindergarten when Obama was elected, so I think that like a lot of my like consciousness was like, sorry, y'all. I just aged myself. But I think that a lot of my like early ways of like viewing the world were definitely shaped by like hearing like little snippets here and there of like what I could understand that was happening on Think Radio. And I do remember that there was like this gardening series that was on there all the time. But yeah, I think that just a lot of my like early and current exposure to the world and like the history of the South and contemporary South is definitely informed by public media.
I grew up with radio, and I think that I love to imagine. I think that's why I love to just like think about things. And I would listen to the radio. And so now I'm just in love with podcasts. And Grace, I think that you really defined for me now I realize it's one word, I thought it was two, world building. That really for me is public media, is the world building part. And I'd like to hear more about world building and the conversations that you had in one of the early podcasts that you did, because that for me is a great way for us to use our imagination and create in our minds what we want the world to be and how diverse we want it to be. And public media really brings the world to me. And your show is a podcast. The world is a podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think world building is this kind of storytelling practice that I kind of got into maybe a few years ago. And the idea is like, what is the world that you want to imagine? And, you know, we did an exercise with viewers like us. After the first season, we invited several people, like a bunch of stakeholders from who had appeared on the podcast and just wanted to envision something different, because the system that is in existence is not satisfying, right? So what is this alternate vision that we could, you know, sort of build toward? And I think that is also kind of what the podcast is trying to do, is like ask, that's why I'm here. I want to know what people think. Maybe you're not interested, you know, that's fine too. But for those of us who are searching for something that is not like commercial media, you know, sort of reality TV, sort of driven by whatever dollars, and is rooted in something much more like basic, like community-centric, historical, you know, like what is it that we can actually build now? Especially this conversation when things are, again, collapsing, right? Mm-hmm. There's an absence, and so there's also an opportunity for something else to be had. This is why the world building should be happening right now, because the world is falling apart.
So well, it's funny, I have two questions. A mess, ignore all this. I have two questions for you, which is, number one, it's not like the radio stations and everything, they're not going away, but they're gonna be, there's a lot of discussion about probably they're gonna be taken over. Mm-hmm. Who's gonna take them over? And what do you, what do you think about the future of all of these entities that will probably be gobbled up by other entities?
I'm very worried. I mean, even if you look at the conversations happening about the merger with Warner Brothers and Paramount, like the less choices you have, it's all just going to be one voice, right? And you know, that's why the need for independent voices and independent outlets is even more important. And especially on like a local level, like if you're not getting access to information or, you know, just the basics that you need, like how are we going to survive, right? Yeah.
And I definitely think about that when thinking about the consolidation of a lot of these things. I'm actually working on another documentary about this radio station out of Memphis, WDIA, which is a long history of being, they're called the Goodwill Station because they were so plugged into their local community. That's where they would go and find information, find news, find things. And then that led them to being able to mobilize in a week's time and literally save this town from bankruptcy. And then a lot of the conversation as we were going through and talking to people is like, will this be able to happen today? Where would someone know, one, what's happening, and then two, to be able to put out a mass call in order to get a response? So we're all consumed with, yes, we have more outlets. We have social media now, we have all these things, but is it a way that we can get information to the people who want to hear it and who need to hear it and are in spaces where it reflects their own community in ways that they can actually engage with it? I think that's different. And even that radio station, they're celebrating 77 years now, but now they're owned by iHeartMedia. And even some of the things that they can do is drastically different than what they could do before. And so we had some conversations with the program manager about kind of how they're toggling things, but it also comes down to they would not be able to exist without iHeartMedia. And so what does that mean when all these smaller entities are being consumed by the larger one for the sake of survival, but what's being lost in that process? And what are we losing as a community in terms of news outlets, in terms of access to things? I think it's a very sad scenario, and it's one of those things we won't realize the impact of what we're losing until we need it and we don't have it. And then how do we get back to typical print media, radio, where we were actually able to consume things that were directly related to us and we knew how to get there, and we can hear things, be exposed to things without having to navigate 5 different levels to get approval for this thing, and now it's out of date.
Or is this real?
Yeah.
Did AI create this? Yeah, there's so many, so many things to work on.
Yes, go ahead. Oh, wait, one sec. She's going to bring you the mic.
I have a question about whether, and if so, what are the conversations going on within organized philanthropy? It's not necessarily the case that funding of, public broadcasting, corporation necessarily means less funding for filmmakers. Those are choices. So what is it? Are there serious conversations going on in organized philanthropy about the situation we're actually facing?
I think there are conversations. Like, for example, there was a big news article about the Public Media Bridge Fund created by a public media company, but that's really just like a stopgap measure. I mean, how do you replace like the millions of dollars that the government was giving toward, public like television and radio?
Right.
I do know that there's like I've been in rooms where kind of California, for example, I was at this conference with California Philanthropy trying to fund local news, and those kind of partnerships are very interesting because I think there is a trend to go super local because the need is there. And what I find interesting for the filmmakers in the room is like, how do documentary filmmakers enter this conversation? Because a lot of these newsrooms are just sort of print or audio, but they're not visual. And I think that that's an opportunity that I think some philanthropists are looking at, and also just, filmmakers and organizations are looking at too. I'm very interested in that because, you know, there's a whole bunch of unemployed like documentary people who could be, you know, supplementing like local news. We know how to do it, you know, like we have the training, we know how to tell stories, and we know how to find an audience and make something out of nothing, because that's what we do as independent documentarians. One of my big critiques was that when everything was going down with public television is nobody came to us, like the filmmakers, to ask us like, how do we do this together? How do we organize together? And that was really like frustrating until it was too late. Oh, please call your congressperson. They're going to vote tomorrow. But we had been, we knew this was coming. We knew this was coming, and we could have been more prepared. And so, I don't know. I feel like this is the time to have these kinds of town halls and like understand who's on board. You know.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I have a question to Grace. I didn't watch Forever Young.
Forever We Are Young. Yeah.
Forever We Are Young.
Yeah.
This is about fandom, right? And this fandom, how do they, fandom as a community, how do they circulate their information and how they communicate each other? Because my ultimate question is about the role of YouTube. Because as he said, many young people do not really watch or listen to NPR or PBS, but they learn things through YouTube, or they make a documentary and circulate through YouTube, or I mean, they meet each other in a similar kind of a taste or interest through other platforms like AO3, or, you know, if you write a fanfic and you do Tumblr. There are other platforms to create the community and produce their contents and circulates. It's a I don't know. It's a kind of there are funded contents, and if you like certain contents, that you send the money to them. So there are lots of kind of ground movements happening, and I think Army, the BTS fandom, also has a ton of those small communities.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's how, for people who don't know, the Army is the name of the fandom of BTS, the big K-pop group. And I made a film about Army, and you know, this was an interesting look at how did they develop into these global superstars. It's largely on grassroots, like organizing amongst the fans. And in terms of YouTube, I think they used YouTube and Twitter like strategically in the beginning because they had no access to the Korean big music shows that everybody had, but they used these free social media to propagate like their, you know, sort of develop relationships with the fans. I think that's what's gonna happen. That's what's happening now with artists and audiences. Like, how do you go directly to your audience and not wait for like a gatekeeper? So it's interesting. I just showed a rough cut of a short film that I'm making that I don't really know who the audience is, but I want to use it as an experiment to partner with like a particular public media station in Rochester run by Chris Hastings, who used to run the World Channel. Mm-hmm. He is now running the station, which also has like a radio, TV, and a movie theater, and a newspaper. And so I said, why don't we try this, this is the time for experimentation, right? Like, I'm gonna bring my short film to Rochester, let's have a screening in your theater, have a community conversation. Like, that kind of thing is just lacking in so many places. We all just go to our devices and our, you know, and look at films that way. But actually, I want to have a community conversation. Can we replicate this in these public media stations that still exist but are kind of looking for content? They don't really have connections because, you know, anyway, this is one of the many experiments that I'm interested in doing. So anyway, there's a long, convoluted answer to your question, but yeah.
I feel like I'm gonna get this station wrong. What, WBOZ, I think. It's a jazz station in New York. So one of my close friends is, she is like, I wish she were here because she is the public media stan. She is also a member of a member of NPR, a member of her like local PBS stations, and she met the owner of BOZ on a cruise. Stay with me. And we're just talking about, she was like wearing an NPR t-shirt and talking about how much she loves public media. And so the owner of BOZ said, why don't you come on our radio station, and because they're doing a pledge drive, and talk about like what you love about the station, and talk about yourself. And my friend who's loved NPR her whole life. This is like, she was texting me all day, like, the dream is happening. And I was like listening. And so I can listen to it online, right? And I'm not in New York City, but I can listen to it online. And they said something really interesting where the owner was like, we were defunded, but we really looked at this as an opportunity to really get to know the people who listen to our radio stations, and to have them give money to the stations, and also be in dialogue with them about the kind of music that they want to hear and what they like. So, they were asking my friend, like, what kinds of music. She really loves hearing Gregory Porter on a radio station. It's something that she wouldn't necessarily hear, obviously, on any kind of regular radio station. And I thought it was an interesting perspective in terms of they were talking about how this was an opportunity, right? And I know you kind of have to say that in these moments, but it did get me thinking about this model that PBS has had for a long time, right? This membership model, but being even more strategic and being more hands-on in this membership model, as opposed to being part of this like bigger organization and then kind of taking little bits. But Ralph, you were going to say something. Yep. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think I'm new to the world of Substack, as in like the last couple weeks new. Mm-hmm. But I think that's similar, right? So this idea that you can create your own channel, you can put out public-facing things, or you can also put out subscription-based things, but you can kind of build this base and connect with people and build this community of information that's going out. And so I think people are figuring out, like, how do we do this and not depend on these giant institutions that have been filling us for a long time, to be honest, before they were defunded. But what does it look like for us to create the community that we need, and how do we get information directly to the audience without trying to go through so many jumps and hoops just to get it to people? And that's if you're getting it to the right people, but just going straight to them. So I do see it as an opportunity. But how are we having that conversation and not just going for the things, but how we have the conversation about it so it's strategic, and we're not leaving anyone behind in the process of identifying the new ways of keeping up with the times of getting media out to the public.
Yeah. Go ahead. Oh, no.
Thank you. Hey, Castell. Grace, are you familiar with the Australian filmmaker, documentarian Beau Miles at all?
No.
So Beau Miles used to teach at a university, long story, no longer. But he sort of does backyard adventures. He's written a book about this. But he did a piece about planting a forest. And for every 1,000 viewers, he calculated out how much money. So essentially, he created a short doc. The money he got from YouTube, he then reinvested by buying trees, and then got a community of people together to plant the trees. And so he also will go to different cities and screen his shorts and have conversation and things like that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I think there are people creating these new models, building community. He does this really nice job of having Aboriginal elders in Australia in his pieces, but being very respectful of their culture and sort of how to tell have them tell their story. So I think there are ways out there, and we just sort of have to start talking to each other more, because I totally agree with you. It's been very frustrating to see what's happened. Yeah. But I also think there's a space now for us to build stuff that serves all of us.
I mean, I was just talking to somebody about the civic assemblies. Do people know about these? I think that's a really interesting opportunity where you bring lots of people almost randomly, like that represent the community, to like engage in a conversation about what do you want public media to do for you and your community. I think it's exciting to think about, like, how do we do this differently? Because the old way, like, what did it get us, you know? Like, it got us defunded. And, you know, my big critique is, like, when it was being attacked, nobody was forcefully defending, like, why aren't we, you know, protecting, like, this important public utility, right? So, but thank you, I'm gonna look him up.
I was actually going to ask you that question about why didn't people actually come to defend the losses that we've suffered in public media recently, because we've had such a long period of time knowing that it was coming.
Yes.
And that was a big disappointment for me.
I think the leadership didn't go there, you know? I mean, I think amongst my peers, we talk about, like, documentary filmmakers are some of the most, like, talented, resourceful people out there. We know how to create an argument. We know how to gather people together, make something out of nothing. And it was too late, you know? Like, I think it was more like, we got this, you know, like, if you know people in Maine or Arkansas or something, call your representative. So what is that gonna do for me? Like, no, we have all kinds of people living in much more populated states like California or Texas or something, and you didn't ask us to do anything, right? And not that we have to be asked to do something, but we're the people that sacrificed everything to get our films on public media, right? We're invested.
One other question, and that is, there's so many amazing community radio stations around the country. I worked at one in Tampa for 10 years, and they are still strong. They still have a lot of support from the community. And I know I lived in Memphis a long time, and that was my station that I listened to. And I'm sad to hear that iHeart, I mean, that really is just kind of devastating for me that's the way it's gone. But there's still a lot of strong community radio stations, and they have built up a number of organizations. So maybe more work needs to go into reaching out to the stations all around, because we did a lot of things with filmmakers when I worked at community radio.
Yeah. Yeah, I think community radio radio feels better to me, you know, because I think it's so much less costly and you can just kind of on the fly do it. But also, like, where are the other places that people gather in public, like libraries, bookstores, you know, schools, right? So.
Yeah. So we have about like 6 minutes left. So I want to just pass it to you, Grace, to see if there's any final questions you want to ask out to the audience. I have some, but, you know.
You start.
Okay. Well, I mean, the question, I had two questions sort of came to me from this, so I'll say both of them, and then whoever feels like responding can. The first is, you know, I'm curious about sort of the perspective of living in the South, right? And already sort of existing in places where the public media stations, the channels were already very underfunded anyway, right? So it's a loss, but it's a different kind of loss. You know, it's still, I'm just curious if the shifting of public media couldn't also be, or isn't also possibly an opportunity for kind of more accurate maybe portrayals of what's sort of happening in this region. Just a thought of there any sort of responses around that. And then finally, how we see public media, like in a perfect world, what would public media look like? What would be on TV? What would be, you know, like I can start in terms of saying, you know, I grew up in New York City, and you know, WNET was my local, Channel 13 was my PBS station. And I had a similar thing in terms of seeing, you know, films from Europe, films from, you know, it's like you could turn on WNET and see, you know, French New Wave things. You could also see independent filmmakers that you had never heard, both documentary and fiction. So it was kind of like a streamer, like what a streamer is now. And there was all of this interesting stuff. So I wish that it could be a place where I could see more perspectives from all over the world too. But yeah, so the two questions are just kind of, in a perfect world, what would you love to see, what public media, what would you like public media to be like?
Thank you for this conversation. I guess I'm coming at this from a little bit of a different, I'm gonna like come back around. But as a person who at one point, in a very Lily Moskovitz way, had a show on public media, it was like I worked for the State Arts Council, and I inherited a show that was very bad. And it was for Troy Public Radio out of Montgomery, Alabama, and they came to us and we had this conversation. They're like, we're going to continue the show and we're going to give you a better time slot. We're going to give you a drive time slot, but you get 2 minutes for the show. So like, you know, Bird Note, Composers Daily. So then the question became, how do we educate the public I mean, the arts are a wedge issue in politics, right? Like in states, we have a weird situation in many states in the South where the arts aren't a political issue because these people who are in the state legislature directly benefit from them. They're going to Alabama Shakespeare, their kids are in the State Symphony in Jackson, like they are directly benefiting from these things. So like, it's actually not an issue. It only becomes an issue when you're in a purple state in a lot of ways. And so I think that there's a channel here that's not just like, there's community and how do we form community, but I think it's less about this community thing and how are they using this against community. So like, how does it become a larger political issue? I think, you know, the culture wars that happened in the 80s are happening and the 90s are happening again. And so it's not necessarily, I don't know. I have big thoughts about that. But I think for me, as a person who is like, had no money, but whose boss gave her time to traipse all over Alabama and to interview people, you know, with the POW, and then to like make these 2 little minute clips. And I forgot about it. And then, you know, I was back in Montgomery a couple of months ago and somebody who was a friend said, I heard you on the radio the other day. I don't live there anymore. But they were still playing these things over and they're listening. People are still hearing. And I think that for me, now I'm coming back to your question, Angela, sorry, to be like, hear these things. As a person who, I'm a documentarian, but first I'm a culture worker. That's, my career has always been in the public sphere. I've worked for state governments in the South, and I'll never not do that because this is a place that matters to me. And now I'm gonna get emotional about it. And to Ralph's point, like my first PBS, I remember my mother trying to take me to swimming lessons and I didn't want to leave because Wishbone was on. Like you know, like those things mattered to me and I learned from them and I continue to learn from them. And now I'm a person who gets to teach others about people like Loretta Bennett, who's a G-Spin quilter, or, you know, Mardi Gras traditions in Mobile, and those things matter, they're important, but they're also like, they're soft ways for us to teach bigger things that have to do with equity and institutions and injustice and all these things. Like, it's the back door. And I think that, like, for me, being able to do that and to develop programs that do that, I know you're poo-pooing on the Gestalt Gardner realm, and that's fine. I personally can't get enough of it. And part of it is because...
That's good, it's on 2 hours now.
I know, and I listen to it. I do. And you know, like, for me, and all that programming, I feel like I'm a part of a larger community in the state. And not just the state, but the region. And I think that you have not just them, but Camille King, they used to come on after. Like, public media in Mississippi is special because you do feel like you're in a part of a community. And I think that as a person who has had a small part in trying to do that, and you don't really see, like, you just put a thing out into the world and hope that somebody listens to it. And I think that's the hard part. But as an active consumer, then you realize that, like, you do. And then, you know, you're driving home late at night and I hear Melissa Booth Hall on the radio because Gravy is playing on PRX. And somebody in the Bay Area might listen to that, or somebody who's not from here gets to hear Caleb Johnson interviewing canners in Appalachia. You have programs like Inside Appalachia, which they're training people who are culture workers in how to do radio, and then sending them out in the world to do that work. And I think that the issue is how then in developing this community is, how do we make these two channels work together? And to your point, this whole question about, like, how do we show people that this matters? And I think part of that has to do with, like, how do we come together and organize, I guess, to show them what that looks like. But anyway, I'm gonna stop talking now because I need to stop talking. But those are the things I'm thinking about.
No, that's great. That was great. Grace, we're at time. Is there anything you want to sort of say?
I really appreciate this conversation. I really enjoyed meeting, like, the students I met today and the work that they're doing. Like, that should all just be, like, on some kind of Center for Southern Studies take over, like, public media in the state. I mean, just the stories alone that I heard that people are working on are incredible. And, like, how would I have access to them? You know, if there wasn't, if I want to have access to those stories, how do I get them? Right?
Yeah.
And it may be in your work when you're trying to figure out, like, who is my audience? Like, I'm your audience, right?
Yeah.
Like, over in LA, I'm your audience. And the entire public is your audience too. It's not, I don't think it's just a regional thing. You focus on that because that's what's important to you, but everybody needs to hear it. So.
Yeah. So let's thank Castell and Grace for this conversation. And viewers like us coming back, what is the status of that?
It'll come back at some point. I'm trying, I mean, yeah, I'm thinking about that. Actually, your point about Substack, I was telling somebody today, I was like, oh, I'm thinking about a Substack as a way to kind of keep people abreast of it. So I'm not there yet. I'm still figuring it out. But someday, yes, it'll come back.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.